All right, here we go in talking about price. And this is the topic that most people think about when they think about purchasing. They think about getting the best deal possible, which, yeah, it's part of that, but it's about finding the right price in the context of what your company needs. So let's explain this a little bit further. Today we're going to cover things like what kind of questions do you have to ask or even think about when talking about pricing of products and services. Another thing is, what are the factors of price? What makes up that price that you end up paying? So we're going to talk about breaking that down. And then we're going to talk about, lastly, in this portion, about some pricing discussions and ethics that happen as you understand price. And this is also part of that pre-negotiation part. All right, so let's start off with, where does pricing fit in the whole thing of objectives of purchasing? Well, if your company wants to be the low price leader, you better purchase stuff that is of lower price than what you're selling it at. So your purchasing strategy needs to align when it comes to price 100%. Otherwise, you're going to be running into situations where you're constantly changing suppliers because you're not in alignment. Now, another one is pricing differences or disagreements can stop the continuity or flow of product. So I'll share some examples a little bit later, but just a real simple one. If you don't agree on price, your supplier isn't going to ship to you, which could result in a stock out situation. Then we come down to, how do you manage pricing? Now, in the second part of the material this week, we're going to be talking about price control and price management. Well, how you go about doing that is that process that purchasing leaders need to focus on making most effective and efficient. Otherwise, it's going to suck up your time and you're going to be wasting valuable company dollars on activities that are not beneficial overall. So, where we are in the 6 R's of purchasing, we are talking about the right price for products and services. So that's chapter 6. And, chapter 7 will be a little bit later, and that one is the right source. Those price and source can go hand in hand, but we're going to start with price first. So, the questions you got to ask. Things we need to ask regardless if it's a physical product or a service. What are we trying to buy? And then what type of market we're in. What is our leverage? We're going to define leverage here in a minute. But what leverage do we have on influencing that price? Mostly in the negotiation phase. And then what's the price structure is our supplier using? Like, how are they coming up with this price? Okay, so we won't be able to answer these questions always definitively, like this is the way it happens, but if we have some understanding of these questions, we'll have a better understanding of the price we're truly paying. So let's talk about what we're buying. It's not just, oh, it's a widget or it's a service to clean my house. We need to very specifically understand what we are asking for. And that could be varied in understanding across the company. There have been many times where I've had to sit in meetings with engineers, with quality managers, even with sales folks and say, what are you asking me to buy? Some people think it should be high quality, some people shouldn't. I know the specifications say that, but we have some interpretation. So let's make sure we all are on the same page. So I'm not having conversations later about the price being too high or too low. No one complains if it's too low, to be honest. So when we talk about what are we buying as well, we're also trying to figure out what type of product. So there are some basic types of products. And here I'm showing them in 4 different categories. We have commodities, generic, special products, and critical. Now, all suppliers would like to convince you that their products are special, but they're not. So let's break down into the definition of what each of these mean. Commodities are products that a number of suppliers offer the same thing, pretty much identical in quality as far as features and even appearance. or delivery of the product or service. There's a generally acceptable level of performance socially or industrial-wise. Like, this is just the way it's supposed to be, not just within your company, but elsewhere. And primarily how you know it's a commodity is when your supply base competes on price. So what I mean by that is if you go to a store, commodity type items are things like tissue paper, toilet paper, paper towels. Yeah, those are pretty common. Other things can be cleaning products. The number one purchased item at the dollar store is cleaning products. They're considered commodities. Okay, now some may be a little higher end or think they're more special, but generally speaking, cleaning products are commodities. There are other things that we purchase that are commodities. Even fuel is a commodity. Anyway, so there's commodity type items. In industrial applications, it could be anything from washers or screws or anything like that that you could buy anywhere that aren't specially coated or have any special features to them, aren't uniquely designed. There could be things like seals or O-rings or gaskets that are common and not specialty. All right. Another category is generics. It's kind of that extension of a commodity. And we know this as consumers because we'll see generics at stores we go to all the time. Like Walmart has the Great Value brand, which is a generic of an item. It's an extension of a commodity in that you're still competing on price, but there may be special contracts that allow the generic supplier to be able to use that formula or so on. So it's about availability as much as that it is price. And that it's not just price competition when it comes to generics. So I would encounter this all the time when we get to products like plastics, saying, oh, well, this is a different type. It's similar. It's not a commodity. It's not special, but it's a different formulation. We'd still have to test it. But there's a higher number of suppliers that offer those generic areas, products and services. Generic services, it's a little harder to pin down, but they do exist, I assume, because we are talking about them. I have not found one yet. Special items, on the other hand, are ones where you have custom tailored something. So this argument would happen all the time at work. Right? We wanted a gasket for something. Looks like a gasket, like any other gasket. Only my engineering team had decided, and it couldn't be a round gasket. It had to be a square gasket. It couldn't be made of the material we can buy out of the catalog. It had to be made out of a special kind of material, which made it unique only to our organization and only to our application. When a supplier has to stop and create something that's different than something that you can buy out of their normal product line or catalog, it then becomes special. And now they're not just competing on price, they're also competing with service. It might be engineering services, quality services, or other services that make them more unique than a commodity or a generic product. So, like I mentioned, starting this slide, most suppliers want to tell you, oh, we're special. But as a purchasing manager and a buyer, you need to understand, are you? Not you personally, but your products. Are they commodities really that you've tried to spin some marketing stuff on me to make me think it's special? Can I compare it to your competitor and have a similar product like for like? So research is going to be required to really flesh out whether it's special or not. Now the critical ones, the critical products, there's a large number of suppliers, possibly, but high value products, customized, made exactly to fit within your organization. You compete on total value, and the design and delivery is usually collaborative. So let me give you an example of this. You may have a service, a security service, or a cleaning service, or a IT service that is completely integrated into your organization. In fact, the employees that deliver the service look just like your employees, only they have a different employer. that would be critical, because if they didn't have them, they wouldn't be able to complete their job, and they have to have access to a lot more to your organization than a typical supplier would. In my old job, working in industrial manufacturing, critical products for us were anything that if it stopped working, that we couldn't get from anywhere else. So ours came down to a few number of suppliers, but it also was part of our core competency of the product. So our papers, the paper that went into our product, that was the filtration aspect, was very critical to ours. We didn't want anyone else dealing with that. We had paper that was specially made for us. It was collaborative with that supplier. So without it, strategic importance would be very, very bad. So first, understand what type of product you're trying to purchase. If it's a stapler, it's a commodity. Now you may have a swing line, which is a commodity, but you also may have an Office Max brand, which is a generic. So figure out where you're looking and what kind of product it is. Not one is better than the other. They serve their own purposes. The second question was what kind of market we're in. Like, what are we trying to do when it comes to price? So when it's a supplier's market, you may hear this when you talk about housing markets. It's a buyer's market, it's a seller's market. Same thing in any other type of trade or environment. A supplier's market means that the demand for that supplier's product is much greater than the supply they have available. So there's a shortage of some sort. This happened a few years back with copper. This happens occasionally with oil type products, right? The demand for it is less than what the supplier can bring. As a result, the price will go up because the supplier has leverage, as well as there is a shortage, and they may be having to pay more to get the same amount that they had before. So that means low volume on the market, so on. The ability for suppliers to get into that market to compete is usually pretty high, because now there's a constrained resource, and they're also not being able to get the human capital, the human resources, to be able to procure and supply and meet the needs of that supply base. Some possible overall market conditions, and these are mentioned in your textbook. So some possible overall market conditions, let's talk about fuel. It is a supplier's market, and it's controlled by a monopoly. And some may even argue an oligopoly, which is similar, but a small set of companies rule the distribution. So airlines can come into that area. It's a near oligopoly. I think that's in your text as well. But these could be symptoms of a market condition. There can be different kinds of markets based on the different types of products. So one area can have a monopoly, and another area could have perfect competition, which we'll talk about next. So that's the supplier's market. A buyer's market, obviously as a buyer, as a purchasing agent, this is where you want to be, right? The supply is greater than demand. So now the supplier is having to decrease the price to meet the buyer's attention and get their bid. So it puts the suppliers in a difficult space, but this is the time when you ask for a price reduction. Volume is there, and you're able to compete on volume. So larger volume gets you lower pricing. That's the idea. Because of that, there's a lot in the market, a lot of resources out there. It's easier for suppliers to enter this. And you'll find these little companies creep up, and they will start their businesses exploiting a buyer's market environment. They'll undercut pricing sometimes just to get in the door. It is a tactic. In this market, we enter a world potentially of perfect competition, where not only we're having to compete on price, but what we also can do after the sale. So those are two market conditions we should be aware of. Where is the market in this particular product? Do the suppliers have more control, or the buyers have more control? And what this comes down to is one word: leverage. So leverage is the ability to influence price in a negotiation. That's it. So leverage can come from a whole host of places. Market conditions is one, and that's where we start this conversation. Other areas, if you have existing suppliers, your leverage may be different with them because you might be a big part of their business. I had suppliers where the spend from the company was greater than 50% of their total revenue. So we were their largest customer. I'm going to have more leverage with them than somebody where I'm only 10% of their business. Now, also, suppliers may be willing to concede on a little bit on price if they see you as a big opportunity to grow and grow their own business. So there's leverage. You have a little bit of leverage in giving them opportunity for growth. And then there's this other aspect, which we're going to talk about later on in the course, about selecting the right source and supplier development. If the supplier sees potential, or you see potential to build a long-term relationship with them, you might have some leverage, right? So there's different types of relationships with our supply base, and one of them is an ongoing or strategic relationship. Others, at arm's length and transactional, are not as much leverage. You're not going to have as much leverage with them on price. Okay, so there's leverage. Leverage is important. Another question we had to ask was the pricing structure. Understand, if you can, even ask the question tactfully with your supply base about pricing. How are they doing their pricing? Is it cost plus? Is it demand-based, value-based, or market-based? Once you understand what is being used, you then can negotiate. And we're going to talk about that in the negotiation chapter a little bit later. But I want to take a moment just to talk about the pricing aspect of negotiation. There are other things you negotiate besides price. So, when we look at it, all products have the same pricing structure. They have the same kind of components to it. They have direct material costs, which can be raw materials or material availability, labor cost, economic conditions can go into the production cost, which are things like the cost of machinery and things, but usually that's wrapped into overhead, same kind of concept. You have selling and administration costs. So if there's a supplier that shows up to your facility once a week, you're paying for that in one way, shape, or form. It could be in their competition strategy, their sales strategy, either way. When you take away the price you're paying and then all the costs, you get profit. Now, there can be different kinds of margin pricing where they'll offer you a price of $100 and then they'll cut their margin down, and that's how they give you price decreases. You have skimming, which is another way, a fancy way of saying, hey, you're just going to take a little bit off the top here, a little bit of top there, things like that. Promotional discounts and things like that. So there are the main factors of cost: direct labor, direct material, overhead. Those are the big ones. On overhead, you'll get production costs, machinery costs, and so on. When we look back, go to the different costing methods. The cost of the product to your supplier, you may not know. What you're worried about is the price. But if you can estimate, your location is in Modesto, on average the cost of machinery, or on average the cost of per square foot, you can kind of figure out some overhead stuff or have a general number. You could also figure out material costs. One of the interesting things that we used to do, we used to buy metals, so we knew approximately the cost per pound. We knew how much was going to be in the product. We can estimate how much material cost, direct material cost there was going to be. We can also estimate the labor cost just because we have statistics that can help us with that. And we knew what we paid our employees. So we would come up with what we called a target price, or we think what would be we willing to pay. As consumers, we do this all the time. We look at a product, we know their features, we say, I would be willing to pay this amount. Even if we don't have a concrete number in our head, we have a ballpark number. What we're doing here, by understanding cost structure and how our suppliers are going to charge us for things, we're trying to predict. So a cost plus method means we have this base level cost of what we think it's going to cost, and what our suppliers might be doing, if they're using cost plus, is going cost plus 10% or cost plus 50%. I've seen cost plus 300%, and that's the price they want to charge you. If you understand that, you have a good idea of what that cost of the good would be, and you see the price they're charging you, you have room for negotiation. Demand-based is that example I used earlier, where you go, there's more demand than there is supply. Example, any kind of Christmas present that is the newest, hottest thing for kids, there's more demand than there is supply. So then you'll find these crazy little gadgets all over the internet for ridiculous prices. That's demand-based. Value-based, things like your Apple products, where it doesn't cost $800 to make a phone. That's ridiculous. If it did, Apple would be out of business. They've got a ridiculous margin on that, and most of it is value pricing. They're charging for the intrinsic value of having an Apple product. So, something to think of there. Nothing against Apple, but that is their method. Then you have market-based. Market-based pricing is, like it said, regulated by the market. There's extreme market pressure to fit within a bandwidth. So the housing market kind of falls into this area. So know what you know and negotiate on that. Now, what I was just describing is a process called predictive pricing or reverse pricing. It requires that research into what kind of market you're in. How is your supplier potentially pricing their product for you? What is their potential breakdown? Where this came into my world was very early on in my career with Parker. We had Ford Motor Company come in and do predictive pricing on a product we were making for them. And the scariest part was they were right. They came in almost to the cent on how much they thought that product cost us, and they were correct. And that was scary, because the reason they did that is they came in and said, we think this product should cost X. We think it's a fair margin. You should make a fair profit margin of Y. We want to pay that price. And we were challenged by them to charge them that price, or we would lose the business. That meant we had to get our act together if we wanted our profit margin to be right, where we wanted it to be anyway. We needed to go and reduce prices with our supply base, figure out cost reductions internally to support that. It was a very uncomfortable position to be in, but what it did is it taught us how to better manage and predictive price ourselves. They didn't tell us their method to their madness, but because in Ford, they had a whole different team. That was their job, was predictive pricing. So we had to train our purchasing agents on how to start looking at our products differently. So everything we've just talked about today is something that our strategic side of our business really had to start to think about and study, and we, over about 10 years, got really good at it, almost down to the cent ourselves. So breaking down materials is one way to do it, understanding cost structures, doing market research, and you come up with this should cost, not because I have a gut feel, though some people, they're pretty good. They should probably go play the Price is Right game. They'd probably make a bunch of money and get a bunch of new products. But this is scientific and documented. So when you have negotiation with your suppliers, you can have a good conversation, just like Ford did with us. So that's an example of pricing and predictive pricing. So that's the end of this section. So we talked about the main questions that we have to ask when we're talking about pricing of products and services. How do we know we're getting the best price? What are we buying? What kind of product? So on. And then we talked about key cost drivers and price drivers for that matter. And then the overall discussion of ethics. So when we talk about ethics, I just want to make sure I hammered that home. We never ask our suppliers directly what it costs them, unless we have the relationship to do so. And we never share pricing with another supplier. So that is just a good way to end a relationship with a supplier right there, unless it's public knowledge. So overview of the pricing discussions and reverse pricing. There's a fair way to do it. Keep your hands clean and make sure you do your own research. Don't be sharing cost with others. It's a good way to end some very good relationships and end up in some trouble. So that's the end of this part, and we'll get into the second part here shortly.